Tariq, thanks for joining the podcast today. Super excited to have you join. Work with a lot of CEOs. You have a great story. You've been a executive of end user organizations like Bumble and Caesars. You've been on the board of companies like Gap, and then you've also been a tech CEO. So looking forward to hearing about your story and sharing your story with our audience here.
It's great to be here, Ben. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to it.
Cool. All right. Well, let's start with your background. Tell us a little bit about how you got into, enterprise and tech, and maybe tell us a little bit about how you kind of got in, and then how you joined the ranks of a business leader within tech. I think that's something we don't hear enough about in the technology industry.
Good point. So, I have a long and winding road of a career. I sort of say it's a bit of a random walk, but it's all. I'm very fortunate that it ended up in a place that I'm very happy with. So I'm an engineer by training. I went to college, grad school, et cetera, for engineering, mechanical engineering. I'm in software now, but started off in mechanical engineering. My first couple of jobs out of school were really in the tech world, right? Pretty entry level roles, a little bit of consulting, a little bit of enterprise software, that sort of thing. I then spent a bunch of time in both the consulting and the consumer world, right? You mentioned Caesars. I was at McKinsey for a long time, and then I was the chief commercial officer at Caesars, which was really my big sort of first big organization that I was fortunate enough to lead, and went from there to Google to help get the cloud business off of the ground. So it's been one of these things that if you had said at the beginning of my career when I was in mechanical engineering, would I end up in the software world? I probably would have said no. And then if you sort of fast forwarded to, 10 years after that, and I'm at McKinsey doing financial services and media work, I probably would have said no, but I had just done enterprise software. And then I end up in the cloud world, and then, other parts in technology. So it's been a very, I'm both very fortunate and I think very lucky, which I guess is the same as fortunate, to have been in the right place in the right time in a lot of different areas. The transition from more engineer to business leader was not that hard a leap because of what I enjoy doing. Right, I really enjoy talking about the vision. I really enjoy setting up sort of operating cadences. If you apply engineering to how do you get the business results that you want, that's what I think of my management style. And I was fortunate enough to have some people who were mentors who helped me get into those positions, and you get your first break and then you kind of things go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Like with a lot of end user organizations we work with, the business unit leaders are not the engineers, right? And we've been talking about this forever. Digital transformation. Now it's AI transformation. 6 years ago, it was data modernization. Can you talk a little bit about like your approach, like you said, on the business side, and how you interacted with the different parts of the business from the engineering perspective? Because I think as an engineer, you think about things as an engineer, right? You're not thinking about it like, how do I run this business process? You're thinking about how can I run this business process with engineering, right? So
that it's a great question, and I think this is one of the things that a lot of people kind of miss who come from more of a traditional business background, right? It's not that you have to understand exactly how Kubernetes works or exactly how a server functions or things like that. It's obviously helpful if you immerse yourself in the product, right? But and I do think if you're going to be a business leader in the technology world, you need to know your product inside out, right? You need to know it as well as many on your product team know it, right? But leaving that aside, I think that there is a way of thinking about problems, right? I often talk about, both first principles thinking and systems thinking, right? And really systems thinking and the sort of system dynamics of an organization and of a product of an ecosystem is, I think, it's an engineering centric approach to how to improve business performance. So to give a super real example of this, when I got to Bumble, it's a dating app, a very successful one. tens of millions of people using it. But fundamentally, if you kind of strip it all away, it's a two-sided marketplace, right? You have to find people who want to meet these very specific other people, and it has to be mutual, right? So it's a two-sided marketplace, not different than Uber, where you have drivers and you have riders, except that in Bumble, you actually have to, the driver has a lot of perspective on what rider they want and vice versa, right? It's not just any rider and any driver.
It's kind of like dating. It's kind of like dating, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know that many people who say I want a 6 foot tall Uber driver. They don't normally care. Whereas that is, one of the things that you tend to look at in dating is height and religion and all these sorts of things, right? But one of the things we did very early on when I got to Bumble was literally lay out how are people successful on Bumble, right? And really thinking about it as a system flow, right? That you need to, step one, step two, and it's a positive reinforcement loop. And I'm giving this as an example because I think it's an engineering mindset approach to business. But then when you explain it to the engineering team, who are many of the most valuable team members in any organization, they get it, right? All of a sudden, you can actually connect the dots between, oh, now I understand what you're trying to build in sales, or I understand why that financial metric is important, because you kind of are showing them how it all fits together, right? And how it all kind of creates these virtuous cycles, these positive reinforcement loops.
That's a great example. And I was a biologist by trade. I ended up in tech, kind of like you. I was in Rome and San Francisco, and you just kind of get into it. And that's very much how I think about things, like your point on systems thinking and architecture and how all pieces work together. For me, it was biological systems. For you, it was mechanical systems, right?
Exactly right.
So that makes 100% sense. I guess you've been at a lot of different types of organizations, right? You've been at companies like a Bumble that have, I'm going to call it digital native, right? You've been at a Caesars that is not a digital native. You work with a lot of organizations now on the security side who may or may not be digital native. Like, what are some of the practices you've seen from the companies who are not digital native, who can start to make progress and start thinking about things in, whether you want to call it cloud native, AI native, whatever you want to call the term, just more modern, right? Because I think a lot of organizations want to be more modern. They're held by a lot of things, like they don't have the processes and the people. And so you could do this thing where you build a whole nother organization and you try to, hire people within that, but that only gets you so far. You really have to transform the way that the business operates, right? So I'm curious kind of any interesting stories you've had, either, customers, partners, your own experience. I'm sure you've had some interesting experiences to share.
Yeah, for sure. If you sort of ask what is the connective tissue in a way between all the different things I've done, the way I would describe it is they're all tech-enabled businesses, right? And I think that actually in this day and age, almost, Mark Andreessen said it over a decade ago now, right? Software is eating the world. Almost every business is a tech business in some way, shape, or form. If you're a car company, the software is as important as the mechanical systems in the car, et cetera. So there is, I think, a growing recognition in the world that this distinction between tech companies and non-tech companies is increasingly blurring and maybe disappearing, right? Is Tesla a car company or is it a technology company? Well, it's a technology company that happens to build cars, would be one way of thinking about it. And the connective tissue for me has been that tech-enabled business, and the throughput the through lines are data and analytics are really important, right? In all of these cases, Caesars runs on data and analytics, and we applied it, I think, in a best-in-class way to marketing and customer segmentation and customer experience and things like that to improve the profitability of the business. So data and analytics is really important, and the willingness that I think comes natural in tech and may not come natural to a lot of other industries, the willingness to raise your ambition and to experiment, right, is a big distinction. Because I had a customer in my Google Cloud days who was in the oil and energy business, right, and we were discussing the difference between Google's approach to cloud when I was president of the cloud group there, and his and the issue that this company was having with embracing cloud.
Hmm.
And he eventually said, you know what? We spent 5 years thinking about the hole we're going to dig, and we're going to put $2 billion into digging that hole. And then we finally say, go ahead and dig that hole. But we can't make a mistake because we spent $2 billion building, digging that hole. And we had to spend 5 years figuring out if that's the right hole to drill, right? And whereas in cloud, yes, you can make mistakes and they can be costly mistakes. But the reality is software is much easier to experiment with. It's much easier to be iterative about. It's much easier to say, we made a mistake. Let's not go right. Let's turn left, right? And pivot. And there's some like laws of physics associated with this. Drilling is expensive and there's nothing you can change about that. But there is a mindset difference, right? And the mindset is, how do we make sure that the data is available to everybody? How do we make sure that we're really capturing and using the data as best as possible? And then how do we have a mindset that says, should we be doing this differently? Should we? And this is, the Google kind of legendary 10x thinking that Larry and Sergey used to insist on, right? That mindset, you find it in startups in the tech world, you find it inside of Google and the largest tech companies. And I think it's sometimes the biggest thing that is missing in a lot of companies that are trying to digitally transform is they almost try and transform the processes as they are and the business as it is, as opposed to saying, how would you reimagine this if we could start from scratch? And recognizing there's real constraints, right? This is not everything should be a digital native business, but it's a starting point and it's a way of thinking that I think is really important.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. The digital transformation is literally, let's just take what we are doing in a data center and just move it to the cloud. And we have now digitally transformed. No, you've lifted and shifted your application, and you haven't changed how you actually operate your development team, which then downstream impacts the operations of the business, right? So I think you're spot on. All right, well, I want to come back to 10x mindset. We could probably have a whole nother podcast on that.
Sure.
So let's talk a little bit about Sonar. You've been doing a lot of different things, a lot of different executive roles. Why Sonar? What was interesting about it? What were some of the things you're like, whoa, I didn't know about this when I joined? And kind of what you're thinking about now that you're over there.
So let me introduce Sonar a little bit. So we are the world leader in code quality assessments and code security. Really, if you're a developer writing code, we've got 7 million developers around the world who use our tools to help check that the code is of high quality. So it's maintainable, it's reliable, it's readable, it's all of, it's generally high quality code, and an increasing number of people who are looking at it and saying, and is the code secure as well, right? Have you introduced security vulnerabilities? And we do this in a way that is very developer friendly. We started off as an open source developer tool, and really have in the industry, there's a lot of talk about shifting left. We talk a lot about starting left, right? How do you just start in the IDE, in the development environment, as you're writing the code with the quality that ensures that your code base gets healthier over time, right? So that in a nutshell is what we do. We've got almost 30,000 customers around the world. 400,000 organizations use us because of the open source footprint. It really is a sort of scale horizontal platform. So that's my commercial, and then I'll answer your question. That we, what attracted me is really coming back to what I was talking about earlier. Software has eaten the world, right? Every company is a software company. Not every company is a great software company, but it is very right. But I think that the difference increasingly, there's this expression that AI is not going to take people's jobs. It's the people who use AI are going to take the jobs of the people who don't use AI, right? There's something very similar in the software world, right? That companies that get better at software, whether you're a car company or a media company or whatever it is, right? You name the industry. The companies I believe that are better at software are going to outperform companies that are not, right? And what excited me about Sonar was just the code is the building block of software, to state the obvious, right? And the quality and efficiency and security of that code, I think, can play just an unbelievably important role in improving overall corporate performance, not just of the IT organization, but of the organization and their success. So I like to do big things. I like to do things that I think are going to have an impact. And this one was a growth stage company. You know, we are 600 people, a couple hundred million of revenue. So it's a scale player, but not Microsoft and not Google, right? Which I've done the Google thing. And so you could really have an impact. And as a CEO, you could really drive the direction of the business in an area that I thought was just going to continue to grow, particularly with AI now transforming software development. I think that we have a right, and it's up to us to continue to earn that right or to lose it. But we have a right to be one of the authors of what happens in the future of the software development world, right? And so that really excites me, right? The similar reason of why I joined cloud in 2016, which was not at the very, very beginning of cloud, but was pretty early days in the cloud world, right? And it was, you could shape the industry, you could shape the evolution. And I find that really personally motivating, interesting, and exciting.
Yeah, I think we're certainly in the, I don't know, a new journey of security, we'll call it, as companies have made that transition to doing data security or doing data analytics and doing cloud. Now it's like, okay, I think we forgot to secure this thing.
Yeah, and you have to build it secure. I think this is the big thing people are realizing, right? Is it's one thing to put up a big wall around your castle, right? But if your castle is going to fall down the second somebody throws an arrow at it or whatever, right? I'm stretching my metaphor here, but if you build it right, if you build it secure, if you build it reliable, there's studies out there that show that if you do that, it's like 1/10 the cost than having to fix issues later on, right? For obvious reasons. If you've got a rotten foundation in your house, you maybe have to tear down the house or do some like real structural rework on it versus taking that extra step to make sure that the foundation is strong. So that's what we really believe, is that by starting correctly, by empowering developers to do this right as they're getting started, by giving them the tools and the data and the information, that we can help companies save, tons of time, energy, resource, customer satisfaction, things like that, because you don't want your application to glitch out when you're on the treadmill or, when you're driving your car or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, I want to come back to improving the performance of the organization and how security can do that, because I think that's a good topic. But I want to talk a little bit about like I guess the organism of Sonar, right? It started out being one thing. You guys have made a couple acquisitions. I thought one of the interesting acquisitions you guys made was in the architecture space. We had a discussion about this before that I thought was super interesting, right? Architects in most organizations work with documents, right?
Right.
They say, hey, like, we're going to build this modern application. It's going to have this Kubernetes thing. It's connected to this backend data analytics. It's it's connected to the data center here. We got to build security over it, but it literally lives as a document, like a Word document or a PowerPoint or something.
Nice picture. Yep.
Nice picture, and then it gets sent to everyone, and then it eventually gets to the developers, and they say, okay, now go build this thing, and it's a piece of paper, and they have to go turn it into code, and there needs to be a better way to doing this, and it's not just a content management system that manages your documents. It needs to be digital. So, talk to us a little bit about how you're envisioning how the code world also works with architecture, because to your point on the, you got to start right on code. You also need to start right on architecture, because architecture is also a very critical skill. It is a very hard thing to do and be creative. And if you don't do it right, to your point on the $5 billion or $2 billion for the 5-year for the oil company, that's literally, you make a bad architectural decision, it might cost you $500 million, right?
Totally.
I'd love to kind of hear your perspective on how you kind of think about, coding versus architecture versus kind of, technology leadership.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, and I think it fundamentally gets back to this point, as you're saying, of somebody has to design how this code base is supposed to work, right? And in many companies, particularly companies that have been around for a long time, there's not been one author, right? The code base has sort of evolved to your biology background, right? It's been an evolutionary process on most large code bases. So yes, if you're starting completely from scratch, maybe you've got some control over this, right? But most companies, even at Bumble, right, we were when I got there, we were about a 10-year-old company, right? And there was all sorts of evolutionary baggage in that, and some of it is what they call tech debt, but some of it was just a little bit of complexity, or, hey, we built this in a monolithic way and it should have been a modular way, and you have this dependency here that nobody remembers why this dependency exists, but now it exists. Like, there's things that happen in code bases. In my geekier moments, I talk about it as the entropy of a code base, right? You're increasingly having, I think the natural state of any large organization managing any large code base left unchecked is that you will have more and more chaos and disorder brought into that code base, right? And it's because you think about a large bank these days, they've got 20,000 developers all working on this code base. How do you make sure, and how do you actually specify, to your point, what the architecture is going to be? And then how do you make sure 20,000 people are actually building towards that architecture, right? Mm-hmm. So if you come back to what Sonar does, our core strength, we'll leave aside all the use cases and all that, our core strength is we believe that we know as well as anybody how to analyze code, right? How to take the code that you have and get insights about what is in that code, including with the acquisition that we did, the structure of your entire code base, right? So what are the dependencies? How is it structured, et cetera? All of that good detail. And we can do that in a way that is analytical, right? It is, yes, we can produce the image because people are visual consumers of information a lot, right? And so you can produce it as an image, but fundamentally it exists as code, as data in a structured way. And so what that means is that we're really good at analyzing code. We can analyze to get your architecture, and then you can basically put rules in place that say this should work this way, and it becomes guardrails, right, for your development team. And maybe they need to violate the guardrail. You can decide as an organization, do you want to allow them to violate it or not? But there's transparency and there's awareness, and our hope is that it helps control this entropy, this sort of emerging disorder on your code base. And what really excites us about this is not just we think this is a big need in the traditional way that software development is done, but we think it's going to be a huge need in a AI-enabled, AI-assisted way of doing this. So we also acquired a company called AutoCode Rover that builds one of the leading AI software repair agents. And as you think about, okay, it's relatively easy to have an agent work on 5 lines of code and fix that 5 lines of code. Mm-hmm. Now multiply that by a large bank who's got 2 billion lines of code. Well, how does the agent, you can hope that a human sort of figures this out and they can ask their friend, they can look at the image, but what is the North Star for the agent, for the AI to start understanding the code base so that they're not adding complexity and they're not adding disorder to this code base? So we think this is something that there's a big need for today. By making it structured and driven by data and driven by analysis, we think we can bring some order to that. And in this rapidly evolving AI-driven world, we think it becomes super, almost an imperative. You can't really live without that architectural understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess what are customers currently doing if they're not doing this, and how would you help customers understand how they can mature their practice? Is this a people thing? Is it a process thing? Is it just a technology thing? Because when you have to change your people and process, that's a lot harder than just swapping in a tool, right? So
yeah, and I would love to kind of naively say that this is just a tech thing and we'll do it all for you, but with everything that you do, I think that there's always a people component to this, yep. Right? There's always a process component, and people sometimes do the hand waving thing and say that there isn't, but there really is. And in this case, you've got architects in most companies, right? Maybe not as many as you had before. Maybe they're not as empowered as they should be, right? But you have architects in many companies. What we're trying to do is to give them kind of the megaphone, right? The tools to actually have the designs that they come up with and the strategy that they put in place be embedded in rules in the development process, that developers at least have awareness of when are they doing something that reinforces the architecture or not. We very much believe that every company should decide what's right, what do they enforce from a policy standpoint, what don't they, right? So our tools are there to enable you as a company to do this the way you want to, but fundamentally having the information will empower the developer and empower the architect to make decisions, right, in a very in a very explicit way, right? To your point, today when I was at Bumble, our architecture was copied in a big, I think it was a big Lucid chart, right? That was just lots of boxes and lots of spaghetti connecting the boxes. And whenever you had a question, you'd go back and try and look at it, and you'd hope that it was kept up to speed. And we did a pretty good job. We took it seriously, but that was kind of the way that this was managed. And what we're trying to do is bring a level of structure and rigor and pull the developers into the conversation, as opposed to this just being yet another thing that people try and impose on the development teams.
Yep, that makes sense. All right, well, I'm super excited to see how it plays out, and I think a lot of people should take a look at it, because I don't think anyone's ever actually thought of it this way. So I think it's super interesting. So talk to us a little bit about the differentiator for Sonar. I think we just talked about some of the kind of newer things you're doing. Kind of you talked a little bit about starting from the left instead of shifting left. I think that's a great tagline too. So what's the big differentiator? You got to this company with a couple $100 million revenue. They were not, I'm going to call it a Silicon Valley company spending money, knocking down doors. They did it because the customers loved this thing. So tell us a little bit about like the origins of Sonar and what makes it unique versus the other, 1,000 companies who are selling developer security.
We're really proud, and I can't take any credit for this, right? The origin of the company and the kind of footprint the company has is really a testament to the early teams and the founders. I joined a year and a half ago as co-CEO with our founder. He stepped down to what he very, I think, with relief in his voice, calls just founder role now, as opposed to co-CEO role. But this was a company that was started because they, as developers, felt a real need, right? That they were frustrated in managing development teams and working themselves, that they didn't have a good way of controlling the quality of the code that was being written by their teams, right? Of understanding it, et cetera. So it started off 16 years ago now, actually, as an open source project in Geneva, right? So to your point, not being Silicon Valley, it was started in one of the more unlikely places to start a company like this. It has grown as a Geneva-based company for 15 years. It has been largely bootstrapped the entire time. So we've got a very deliberate way of working, right? That is super kind of core to our DNA. We've been cash flow positive, I think, from day one. We're very cash flow positive now. And growing very nicely. So it's sort of a rare company these days that didn't do the growth at all costs. And to your question, Ben, it's sort of the reason why this has all worked so well is because they focused on the developers and how do we actually give the developers insights and tools that they want to use, right? And one of the things we're proudest about is just the level of kind of open source and developer-led adoption, whether that's the paid version or the open source versions, because it really means we believe that we're delivering value to customers. Our number one of our top 7 priorities, or of our 7 priorities for the company, is be indispensable to developers, right? It's sort of the North Star for us. And that's not just a mission statement or a number one priority, but it drives real product decisions and real go-to-market decisions that we have, right? It is, we focus obsessively on minimizing false positives, for example, right? So any code scanning tool, you're going to make some mistakes. You're going to identify an issue that's not really an issue. And you can imagine developers will look at this, and if you do this 8 times out of 10, it's a false positive, they're just going to tune you out, right? If you do it 50% of the time, they're probably going to tune you out, right? And so part of the North Star, again, part of what's critical to being a developer tool is to make sure that you're not disrupting their workflow, which means that you're giving them a lot of signal and relatively low noise, right? Now, that's different from what you might do if you're building a tool explicitly for a security engineer, or if you're building it for a CIO or something like that. They may have different priorities, right? And it's not that we ignore those priorities, but fundamentally our North Star is what will get a developer to actually use the insight that we're developing, that we are providing.
Yeah.
And that has been, I mean, it's part of what Olivier focuses on, being, the founder, the just founder, as I mentioned, is, he's almost the guardian of the developers inside of Sonar, right? As we try and do more for some of these other personas, he's always there saying, all right, but how does this work for a developer? Is it adding value or is it adding noise, right? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think working with a lot of founders of developer companies, there's like a purity to what they do, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like, okay, great, like Jyoti at Harness had started App Dynamics and some other companies.
Sure. Yeah.
But when you go out and start these companies, you're thinking like, hey, like, oh yeah, I can make a lot of money. There could be a different tool. It's like, no, I literally, as a developer, need to change the way that developers work because this sucks as a developer, and it's like, I'll figure out how to make money later. Let's figure out how to build a better tool.
Exactly right.
And I think that's the beauty of these developer ecosystems. And it's shocking to see how many of them sometimes exist, but it's pretty incredible how fast they can grow if you are literally just focused on, like you said, the customer, right? The ICP. And so I think it's interesting to see how those companies evolve and how fast they can grow and get to the size that you're talking about in a very quick period of time. And then you can layer on, okay, great, now we got to like make a business out of this thing. But they're able to run a pretty nice business without getting to that scale, right?
No, I mean, we have a business that's got 7+ million developers who use the platform. We're very proud of it. And yes, we built the reports that a chief compliance officer can give to the regulators to show that so it's not that we're indifferent to the enterprise needs, but there is no business, there is no product if the developers don't use it, right? And the sort of notion of train and pray, like I'm going to train my developers on this tool and I'm going to pray that they use it, right? Like that too many enterprise software companies in the developer space try and do that, and they find that they're spending a lot of time and energy on stuff that developers are just not excited about, right? And do we get it right all the time? We don't. And we were just in a product review this morning, and one of the things we were talking about is, our false positive rate, which we think is best in the industry, is still too high because it's not zero, right? And so how do we make sure that we are continuing to get better? And so we're not resting on our laurels here, but to your point, like the purity of what we're here to do, right? It's got to be easy to use. It's got to be compelling. It's got to be high signal, low noise, et cetera. Like these things are and they can't interrupt the way developers do things. This is the other like super important thing, right? That you get into a flow, you don't want to get out of it, right? How do we kind of attach ourselves to that and help that?
Yep. So two things, and then we'll kind of wrap here. I want to talk a little bit about AI. You probably saw a lot of that at Google and Bumble, and I'd love to kind of hear your perspective on that. And then the second thing is, what are some of the challenges you're seeing with customers at Sonar, and how is that evolving, right? Because the challenge with security is always like, okay, great, we've whacked that mole. Now it's like we got another 10 just popped up. Like, so what? How is that kind of evolving? So pick whichever one you want to start with, but let's cover those two things, and then we can wrap.
Well,
and then we'll do
it.
And then we'll do another podcast on the 10x mindset.
Perfect. Sounds great. Yeah, I mean, we happen to be, we Sonar happen to be very lucky, and there's that Chinese curse, I think it's Chinese, of the may you live in interesting times, right? Or something like that, right? So it's, we one of the industries that is being disrupted the fastest, or one of the areas that's being disrupted the fastest, is software development, right? And it's not that software development's not going to exist. It is that it is fundamentally changing, right? Cursor and Codium and Copilot and all of these things are absolutely changing the way that software developers work, right? And it's really, I think a lot of the press out there about this has got it wrong. There will be a lot more people who are able to write web pages and software and whatever from scratch because of some of these new tools, right? The barrier to entry to be able to create software is super low and getting lower now because of these tools. So there's a huge impact there. If you are working inside of a large car company, you still have to make sure that it's not going to crash and it's going to be secure and that nobody can hijack the car and whatever. And so the way that AI is impacting those companies or the developers in those companies is very different. In our mind, what we see the nearest in impact being is that it just reduces or can reduce a lot of the toil work, a lot of the repetitive work, a lot of the things. Stripe put out a study about a couple of years ago that said that half of a developer's time is spent on stuff that is not creating value, right? Meaning it's documentation, or not that doesn't, it's necessary but not sufficient, right? And debugging and remediating tech debt and all of these things. And so I think that AI is going to play a very massive role in the software development world, and it's going to be very different depending on what slice of that world you look at. We at Sonar play much more in that slice of, complex code bases, and companies that need to make sure that they are shipping high quality and highly secure product, right? So not my kid's trying to build a website, or I'm trying to, whatever. And this gets to your question on how our customers changing. So what we're seeing is that there's an explosion of code, right? More and more code is being written because you can actually write it faster with some of these tools that are out there. And that's generally a good thing. And that code has hallucinations and it has errors, and there's malicious attacks that are being put into the LLMs themselves, right? So that it generates malicious code on the back end or in the output. And it's creating a whole new level of uncertainty. And the uncertainty is on the security side, but it's also on just the reliability side. We've spoken to one customer recently who said that they're now experiencing an outage a week because they're using AI code generators, and they realize that their code review practices are not up to the standards needed to have all of this code that no human is writing, right? And by the way, it's not that the problems that are coming up, these issues are not easy to find issues. It's not like you put in a comma and it should have been a semicolon or something like that. This is, I made up a library name because, it seemed logical that it should exist, right? That's a type of problem that an AI would come up with that a human may not come up with, right? So they're really subtle and they're really hard to find. And so for us, a lot of what we're doing with customers is helping to say, all right, platform engineering is now a real thing. You need to standardize your development toolkit, because your tool chain, because all of these changes makes the rigor and the discipline and the structure that much more important, right? So you see, I think, a real strengthening is what we're seeing of these platform engineering teams that have been stood up in the last 4 or 5 years. And we are kind of riding sidecar, shotgun, whatever the right expression is, to these AI code generators in many ways, because you generate the code and then you need to check it for quality and security. So for us, it's a really interesting new dynamic. And then lastly, the expectations on, I have an issue, I want to fix it. If you went back 4 years ago, the answer to this question was most of the time, educate the developer on why this is an issue so they can figure out how to fix it. Yeah. Now it is, hey, take all the context that we have about what created the issue, feed it into an LLM, and see if it can come up with a fix, right? So again, it's changing everything, but in very different and very subtle ways. And I think the one thing I caution my team on constantly is, don't believe the headlines, right? The headlines are almost always sensationalist in some way, and it's going to have a bigger impact in some parts of the market than we expect, and it's going to have a very different impact in other parts of the market. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think the first headlines for the AI code generated stuff was about 2 years ago, and I was talking to a lot of development leaders, and they're like, it's not that great, but it's good enough to work for kind of entry level developers, right? Which enabled them to kind of get going with code. But just in the last 2 years, I think it's gone from just like junior, entry level, to now junior, to now advanced. Like in 2 years, we've seen the progression of this proliferate across entire development teams, right? Because it's gotten so much better. And it's so the headlines are certainly sensationalist, but I'd say we're maybe like a year away from every headline you see today. Like we're getting closer,
and the rumors of the death of software engineers has been greatly exaggerated, but the way that their job's going to work is going to be very different, right? And some of the best software engineers I know use Cursor or use Copilot, right? But they use it to supplement what they're doing, right? To almost take away all the tedious tasks that they're working on, and they get to focus on other things. So I'm by no means saying that it's sensationalist and it's not going to happen, but it's almost oversimplified, and the impact will be very deep and very different depending on what part of the systems you're looking at.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I think my comment was really about how this was kind of like magical, like unicorn 2 years ago, and it's now becoming real. So that 100%. So I guess kind of closing out, Tariq, on the AI piece, you saw a lot of companies at Google that were doing this, right? You might even have been doing this at Caesars. Are you seeing that the playing field is kind of leveling now because the tooling, like you said, and the ability to manage this is just democratized? Like it's democratized across every business, every function. Because in AI, it used to be like, hey, you got to go build a bunch of stuff, spend hundreds of millions of dollars. Now it's like you just need to, like you said, just plug into an AWS or a Google or whatever, hyperscaler, and you're off and running, and you can experiment, right? So how do you feel like things have changed? Is it going to really level the playing field, democratize it, or is it, to your point, like the people who are just better at software are just going to continue to win, and the gap is going to continue to get bigger between the ones who are good at it and the ones who aren't?
I think that's what I would say, right? It is, if you go back to cloud, right? The companies I think that have done best in the cloud, the kind of traditional companies that have done best in the cloud world are the ones that were ready to change the way they do things and to become more adaptive and things like that. And I think that the AI world is very, very similar, and it really does get down to that expression of it's not that the humans disappearing, it's not that the companies disappearing, but the companies that do AI better are going to outperform the ones that don't. So I do think that's the case. However, I'm not sure democratizing is exactly the right word. The waterline has risen, right? Because now if you want to do something, right, if you think, and Satya Nadella said this in a podcast not that long ago, that a lot of enterprise software right now is basically a CRUD database with a nice user interface on top of it, right? It's probably unfair to many people in the enterprise software world, but there's a truth to this, right? You have your data, and as a company, you couldn't make good use of cloud if you didn't have your data in good shape. In an AI world, it's 10 times more important than it was then, right? So you have to have your data in good shape. And if you do, you can actually start building your own applications. You can start doing things much more easily than you could have 5 years ago, right? So I do think it is raising what's possible, and everyone has access to it. So from that standpoint, I guess it is democratizing the capability, but now it gets down to people and process and mindset.
Yeah, 100%. I think context, right? I think that's going to be the key, is like, can you, and this is the chasm that I see, like, our CTO and our product team have done AI for like 15 years. So like, it's not like we're brand new to it, but, I think it still relies upon a very smart engineer, like we talked about when you started your career, to understand the context of the business. That is still the chasm, because the technology is never going to understand the context, right? And that's still the challenge that the business leaders have to engage in this. So you can do very simple things like the ChatGPT thing. That stuff is very simple. I think we're going to rely on the ISVs and the vendors even more now with AI than we ever have before, because they're thinking about it differently, right, than the enterprises who are trying to really tackle this, who just are trying to do the same thing they did with cloud, right? And modernization, which is like, let's just put AI in our process. This is really transformational, right? And I think it's going to be super fun to watch, and I'm enjoying it so far.
Yeah, I was on just before this call with our chief growth officer, and we are using some functionality from Stripe, which is great. And he was sort of marveling at the fact that he no longer needs to relearn SQL because the essentially chat interface to get business insights out of the database there is just so intuitive and so easy and so effective, right? And so it really is changing user interfaces. I think it's making a lot more of the information of a company and the data of a company accessible to other people, which is great. And then to your point, then you're as smart as the question that you ask, right? And
That's right.
and
That's right.
really understanding what questions to ask will become a huge value. I can't remember who was saying this, but there's this. I have kids who are about to go to college, and you keep wondering, all right, what should they be studying? And I think it was Joe Lonzo or someone like that said maybe it's philosophy or something like that in the future, right? Because knowing what questions to ask and knowing how to critically think will be even more important in the future than they have been so far because of AI and LLMs and all of that. So
yeah, I think psychology, philosophy, i.e.
yeah.
prompt engineering.
Well,
All right, Tariq.
and how to critically think about the results that you're getting back, right? That's the other critical part. Like an LLM will tell you something. You got to figure out, is it making it up, and is it actually smart, and what do you do with it, right? That becomes the competitive advantage now, not the asking, not who can write the fanciest SQL query, right? So
yeah, good, awesome point. All right, Tariq. I think we
Thank
covered
you.
pretty much everything here, and it was a heady conversation. I appreciate the comments about entropy as well. So very
It's
very
quite
good to
a
see you
geeky
again.
way to put it, but I enjoyed it. So.
All right, Jake. Good to see you,
Thank
and
you.
looking forward to our
Appreciate
next
it.
one.
Same.
Okay, bye-bye.